Hello and welcome to the Situation Report, where we give you the information that you need to navigate an ever-changing culture. And today we're diving into a topic that specifically connects to an ever-changing culture. Chad, we're jumping into something that is a very, very important topic, and we've discussed this in past shows. We want to put the information on the table so that people who are listening and trying to figure out where they stand on some of these issues, where they can make informed, educated, real decisions instead of just accepting what they're being told. And the issue that we're getting into today is one that is hypercharged in our culture. There's a lot of misunderstanding and minomisinformation, and we want to bring some truth to this very, very important issue.
Yeah, transgenderism.
Yes.
It's a subject that I think a lot of people don't want to talk about because they don't want to go there. They're worried about backlash of talking about it. And frankly, I think a lot of people are very misinformed about it, myself included, as we begin to prepare for the show and talking to our guests and doing the research. Yeah. There were some things that I had wrong. And we're talking about something that's become such a large issue, but for such a small population, less than 1% of our culture would be considered transgender, and from what I'm just been recently told, less than around 4% would fall into the LGBTQ, and I know we keep adding letters after that. And so, a big issue, small part of the population, but nonetheless very important topic to discuss and see how we could navigate it.
And it is a very important topic, and politics aside, because we need to move away from the politics of it, there are very real people being impacted in very real ways, and families being impacted in very real ways. Again, whether you fall on one side or the other of this topic is not my point right now. There are very real people who are dealing with this conversation, and I don't think always with the best information.
That's right.
So we wanted to bring Walt Heyer. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And talking about this. We have about 30 minutes to discuss one of the biggest conversations we can. We're going to break it all down in the next 28 minutes.
Yeah.
Walt, I'm going to give your bio here, and I wrote it all down because I just didn't want to get it wrong. And then I'm going to ask you to jump into this. Prolific speaker and writer on the topic of the transgender lifestyle and its causes on the aftermath of transitioning. That's one of the big areas that you deal with. What makes you an expert? You identified as a transgender woman for 8 years, and now specifically address those who regret going through that process of gender change. This is an extremely sensitive topic, one that many, many people are very passionate about, and I think it's become almost a human rights issue, and with that as the backdrop, so much of what's factual has been lost.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you just coming and talking about this and sharing your story. And if you could, just start by sharing your story.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. It is very complicated, multi-layered, very confusing, and it's really hard to unwind all of it. But I came to it when I was actually 4 years old, was the first time when I started this. I started cross-dressing as a 4-year-old. However, that was in 1944. So I'm coming with 75 years of experience, either having lived it, walked through it, struggled with it, and the last 30 years I've been researching it as I came out of the life of living as a transgender woman named Laura Jensen. And so once I got involved in this as a kid, what I realized was that when my grandmother made me a purple chiffon dress because I showed some interest in wanting to dress as a girl, what we realize today is that has such a huge impact on young people, because at the very time you're putting them in a dress, and today we call it affirming them, but my grandma told me how cute I looked, how wonderful I looked. That affirmation is at the very same time you're saying that, you're saying there's really something wrong with you as a boy. And so you begin this sort of split in the individual's psyche. It's really hurting the boy side, and you're trying to develop the girl side psychologically. A 4-year-old, what does he know at 4 years old? So the impact is, I'm talking about it when I'm 79, so it's the impact of that event. I'm still talking about 75 years later.
Lifelong impact.
That's the point we're talking about here. So what we know now in working with the people that I work with, that many of them came to this at a very young age. And most of us, when we sit around and talk like we do who've been through this, we call it child abuse. And, this is a hard word, but we call it child abuse for the psychological impact, for the emotional impact and for sometimes the sexual implications of doing that. So as I went through this, and as a child, and once my family found out that I was cross-dressing as a young boy, my uncle began to sexually molest me when I was 7 years old. So had it not been for the purple dress and cross-dressing, my uncle wouldn't have been sexually molesting me. So you see how the purple dress began to even impact my life in a different way. So these are critical things. And I would say of the people that I work with, 50% of them were somehow sexually, physically, or emotionally abused.
50%.
50%, yeah.
When you say people you work with, people that are struggling with transgender decisions.
Right. Well, I have a website called Sex Change Regret and have for 10 years, and people contact me to try to help because they want help to come out of it. And they end up having gone through it. They identified as a male or female, switching genders, or
surgically.
Some of them surgically, some of them just socially, and then they regretted it, and they want to know how to get their life back. Right. And sometimes it's a spiritual issue, sometimes it's an emotional, sometimes it's psychological. Yeah. But it's very complicated, but it's also quite interesting. And so that's primarily what we do. And I know I had my surgery when I was 42 years old, so I was pretty far along in life. But by the time I hit 50, I had been studying psychology at UC Santa Cruz, and I began to realize as I opened up the books in the library that these individuals have psychological disorders. The first one I studied was separation anxiety, and where this boy had lost his mother died, and he decided that he wanted to be a girl, and in following this particular case, the boy decided to put on his mother's identity is what he was doing so that he didn't feel like his mother was gone. In other words, if he became his mother, emotionally and psychologically and socially, then his mother was still there. So you can, if you just think about that for a minute, that's a psychological disorder.
Yes.
You're not appropriately dealing with the mother's death. So those are just some of the things that happen.
One of the things that you talked to us about last week when we were discussing this and preparing for the show, you clarified for me something I did not understand when you defined the difference between, we lump all of these things together, right. The LGBTQ, and again, this is an opinion, this is just a truth.
Yeah.
And you broke that out very, very cleanly.
Right.
Can you talk about what does it mean to be transgender? What exactly is that?
This is really something that doesn't get talked about, and that's why I'm glad we're able to do that today. The word transgender, if you just take that and make it like an umbrella, because the truth is there are no transgenders. They don't actually exist. And so what we have is underneath that umbrella is this group of people who, as an example, if they might have what we call autogynephilia. Well, what's autogynephilia? That's a guy who dresses up in women's clothes and looks at himself in the mirror, and he becomes the object of his own affection. In other words, he becomes aroused sexually by seeing himself as a female in the mirror. He's not homosexual, and in many ways he's not heterosexual. That becomes his sexual arousal, which is kind of bizarre, right? Autogynephilia. I would say the vast majority of men who contact me or wives who contact me about their husband switching genders, they have 4 kids, have been married 20 years, he says he's transgender. I start working with him and find out, no, that's autogynephilia. And the difference is people prefer to identify as a transgender, put themselves under that word transgender, because doesn't it sound a whole lot better than right. saying I have a sexual fetish disorder, right. autogynephilia? I mean, that's not going to go over good at the cocktail party. And so, and then you have another one called transvestic fetish, which is they become aroused by just one piece of women's clothing. Maybe it's shoes, maybe it's undergarments, and so another sexual fetish. But then there's other, and they're not really transgender, but they want to identify under this umbrella. Then you have the people that we've heard a lot about, drag queens. Well, drag queens are almost always homosexual, but they don't actually, most of them don't go through a lot of surgery. They don't do what we call bottom surgery. They'll do top surgery. But they're homosexual men, and most heterosexual men who struggle with their identity don't become drag queens. So you have this large, I would say over 90% of the men that I work with are not homosexual, which usually shocks people. They have an identity disorder, and it may be that they have body dysmorphia, which means they just don't like that instrument on their body and they just want to get rid of it. It's not homosexuality, just for some reason they want to reject it. Or they have schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, or dissociative disorder. So we have these group of disorders that they fall into that don't get properly treated. And so when they go to a therapist like I did, you go in and you tell them about your history and they automatically say, well, you have gender dysphoria. Well, you don't.
Yeah, we've heard that term in the military a lot, gender dysphoria.
Yeah.
When we look at groups of people going in the military and the issue in the military of allowing transgenders in or allowing people in the military to transition, and the pushback from people who would suggest that shouldn't be in the military, me included, have used that term gender dysphoria, which is a clinical diagnosis for.
And it's overused. Mm-hmm. And the truth is, if the clinician who is interviewing the person, which I do after they contact me and say they regret doing it, we sit down and I always ask them, tell me what happened. What was the event that happened that you saw that changed your trajectory? Mm-hmm. And what was that event?
Is there denial initially? Like, no, nothing, I'm just this way?
Yeah, right. There always is. And I spend time with them and then they begin to identify something.
But there's always an event.
In the people that I've worked with, 100% of the time when I work with them, they can tell me what happened and tell me the event that happened.
The traumatic event that changed the trajectory of it all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
it's always under, I mean, I would define it as child abuse and a child abuse event.
It's either that or it's so traumatic for them. In some cases it can be seeing their mother abused by their father. And in some cases they see a father who's somebody, if they're a guy, and they see their father abusing the mother so much that they don't want to be like that. So they would prefer to identify as a female than to identify as the person who's an abuser, an alcoholic, a drug addict, whatever he is. Yeah. So there's these things, like I said, it's very complex. And to find out what the trigger or what happened to them to cause them to run down this path, I have found probably 80 to 100 different events that come into that play. So it takes a lot of effort to find out that, when we're giving this diagnosis of gender dysphoria, which I always say is kind of funny because I've said this before. I said you could put a rock in front of one of these specialists and they would diagnose it with gender dysphoria because they just see everything through that prism.
Right.
And when I'm working with people who've been sexually abused, who were given hormones and who had body parts cut off, and they lived 3, 5, 6, 10 years as a different identity, sex gender, then I sit down with them and say, can you tell me what happened? And if the therapist were to do that, we could probably stop 90% of the diagnosis of gender dysphoria.
Do therapy early on, catching
it. But the therapists who do the work of helping people transition refuse to diagnose any other disorder like autogynephilia.
Yeah, or confront.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. So we have these.
The affirmation not only from people in their social life but also from the clinicians.
Absolutely. So affirmation is what leads them down this path. The affirmation is what is actually causing them to end up having regret because they didn't deal with what happened to them. If they're depressed, why were you depressed? If you have anxiety or emotional disorders or sexual disorders, they don't care to address them. They would prefer to give them hormone therapy and give them surgery and send them down the road.
And we're in a cultural affirmation right now, right? I mean, our culture as a whole.
Absolutely.
Related to this
subject,
yeah.
Yeah.
What's interesting, with that, and if I could maybe go from that and then ask a question. Chad and I have talked about this in the past, even as it relates to the military and those kind of things. As an American who believes in freedom and individual liberty, I would stand up, and we talked about this.
Yeah, I would too.
I would stand up for any adult's right to do whatever they want to do. So this is not about taking away the right of someone to do it,
right.
but rather as you said, helping to frame the conversation and get to the heart of what's actually causing that decision to be made. And so many people who have the right to do that, I'd protect their right to do that. I'd say they have a right to do that. But really saying they have a right to do that and ignoring the underlying problem is not helpful. As much as our culture would like to say it's helpful to ignore don't look over here. This is what we need to focus on. How have you been, you've spoken on this hundreds of times, how have you been received as you've had these conversations with folks?
Actually, might surprise you. I mean, there's a few people early on when I started doing this 10 years ago that were a little harsh.
Yeah.
But, as the years have gone by, I've had people who are living the life as a transgender write me and say, Walt, keep up what you're doing because I see my friends struggling and you're on the right track and you're actually helping people. So I've been amazed by how many people in the life have written me and tell me, please continue what you're doing.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, why you and I agree on adults' right to make those decisions in their life, it's the imposing it on others, particularly on children, and indoctrination process that really
the children,
scares me.
That is just so unbelievable. And we talk about things, what the causes are. Sometimes we have parents today that maybe have 2 or 3 kids, and a boy comes along and they want a girl.
Yeah.
And the parents are the cause. Because they're taking advantage of the opportunity to go in and tell the therapist, my kid has this feeling. I had 2 people within a week. One, actually, the mother and dad took him to a gender clinic at 15 and said, this kid needs to have hormone therapy. At 18, he had the complete surgery, genitals, the whole thing, breasts put in. At 19, he contacted me, and he said, I want my body back. I feel like a Frankenstein monster, and my parents helped me do this. It's a train wreck. What can I do? And I had another one where the mother was actually a psychotherapist, and the mom thought the kid had gender dysphoria, and he wrote me a letter and said, my mom's putting me through this stuff, and I don't want to do it. Can you help me? Now, there's a real battle for you, right?
Yeah. We're told that something between 65 and 95, the number is hard to nail down, 65 to 95% of children who go through this process before they're 18 will eventually work to transition back. If those numbers are right, and you could illuminate that, that's doesn't support the position to push children through that process.
Well, there's some critical things to know about that. If we leave the child alone and don't affirm them, don't give them a new name and tell them to go to school if it's a boy, it's a girl. If we don't affirm that and don't push that, up to 92% of them will desist by the time they're adult.
92%.
Up to 92%. It can somewhere between 80-some% and 92%.
They'll grow out of it.
They'll just basically grow out of it. Yeah. Here's the problem. And the side who's advocating for this knows this. If we get them on hormone blockers and get them going down the path of cross-dressing, identifying, and going through this whole thing, 100% of them will stay transgender.
Yeah.
Because they're locked in. They've changed. Once you begin to stop puberty and begin to interrupt the natural development of the body, you've interfered with the process that God had intended for them to go through. And so you're playing God with somebody's body.
Catching them early and
they know that. This is why they keep lowering the age group. I mean, they're cutting girls' breasts off now at 12 and 13 years old and putting them on hormone blockers. They're doing it with younger and younger, which is, to me, a total tragedy.
Yeah. Well, we could be here for 3 hours and 30 minutes, but so I got to interject here and ask the really important question for me, and I don't know the answer to this exactly, but for the listeners, what brought you to the turning point in your life? What was the transition point for you?
Yeah, I thought I'd done the right thing. I thought this was cool, and I was going to be a psychotherapist. So I started studying at UC Santa Cruz. I was going to go get my PhD, and I was going to help people transition. Right?
So this is while you were had surgery, 8 years as a woman?
I'm Laura. I'm at school as Laura. I'm going in and I want to study this. And so then I began to see, as the case I told you about, separation anxiety was the term for it. because he was identifying his mother. I thought, well, this is interesting. The more I studied it, the more I realized there are underlying causes. And nobody's talking about the underlying causes. When I went in and was approved by my therapist, he didn't ask, I told him my story, about how I was sexually abused, what had happened, the cross-dressing. And he said, well, what you really need is hormone therapy and reassignment surgery. And I'm on hormones for 2 years, and then they do the surgery in 1983. So, but he was wrong. What he needed to do is what I'm so passionate about today, is sitting down and trying to find out what's causing you to not like who you are. What happened? Tell me about what happened. And it's amazing, the stories that come out of these. Every one of them has a story to tell. We should be actually talking about their stories. We should hear them. Many of them are too embarrassed to talk about them. But it's funny, once they are able to regurgitate what happened and be able to deal with it, the healing begins right at that point, because then they know they weren't born that way. They know that they didn't need hormone therapy. They know that they didn't need surgery, and they know they'd been lied to, and they know that they could never actually, quote, change genders, because that's impossible.
Right.
So the whole thing was a lie, and that's what we're dealing with.
So why, I don't want to get off subject here, but what is the underlying motive for indoctrination?
Well, I wish I knew, I can't get into their head, but there's primarily, this was originally driven by 3 men who were pedophile activists. That's how it got started. It was Harry Benjamin, John Money, and Alfred Kinsey, kind of as a group. The 3 Musketeers are the ones who started this, because they believed that effeminate boys would be easy to transition. And so they began this work on hormone therapy and reassignment surgery. And then the first surgical procedure that I know of was in 1966 at Johns Hopkins University. And what's so interesting is by 1979, there was a Dr. Charles L. Ihlenfeld who spoke about, he had worked with 500 men who had transitioned to women. And he was an endocrinologist, well-known, and he came out and spoke to a bunch of clinicians, and he said, I am leaving the practice of endocrinology for transgender people because I see too much unhappiness, and there's too many that end in suicides. He said, I'm going to become a psychiatric doctor so that I can actually help them. That's what we're talking about. See, he wants to go to the underlying causes, because he realized, like I do, if you spend time with them, there's some underlying cause. They're not born that way. They don't need the hormones, and they don't need surgery.
One final question. Again, we'll hopefully, we talked about this a minute ago, we can have you come back and kind of go some different directions perhaps with this. But hope is something that we talk about a lot, and it's super important, hope.
Yes.
Without hope, we don't move forward. Without hope, we really don't have a reason to live. As you're dealing with people, in your work, how do you communicate the hope? Where is the hope found for those who are coming to you saying, I made this decision, I wish I hadn't, or they don't know they shouldn't have, or whatever the case, and you're offering hope. Where do you find the hope?
Well, I came back to being restored and redeemed through Christ. And so I always offer that hope. I work with people who are, sometimes they're Jewish, sometimes they're atheist. So I work with a broad range of people come from different backgrounds. But I talk to them about how I was redeemed and how I came through this process and how powerful the Lord Jesus Christ is in redeeming lives. If we're ready to get down and say, once they came to realize that this was a mistake, they didn't need this, then where do you turn? You turn to the guy who actually created you, that's Jesus. And so that's the hope that I give them.
The ultimate hope.
Some of them come to that point, some of them don't, but they detransition, and I'm living in their head because they know that they heard it, right? And so the message, it doesn't have, for me, it doesn't have to come at that moment. They don't have to come to know Jesus. I want them to detransition. I want them to get their life back. And I do believe that over time, that will come to their restoration. The Lord will come to their restoration and recovery.
Yeah. You're planting that seed. That's awesome.
Yeah. Can you talk 2 things? One, about this book.
Yeah.
And where people can get that.
Articles of Impeachment.
Yeah.
And it's not by Nancy Pelosi or
No,
Jerry
no.
Nadler. Right?
Different articles of impeachment.
Yeah.
Talk about this book, and then talk about where people who are interested in the work that you do can find you and get more information.
Sure. This book I actually started writing long before this impeachment thing. The articles in here started in 2015. And what I've done is this is articles, 55 of them that I've written, that talk about the things that we've talked about today. It has the research information in there. It has personal stories about people and their own redemption. And so this book is real critical about whether it's a child. I have things in here on children, adults, autogynephilia, things of that nature. So the information is here, but if you go to my website, sexchangeregret.com, you'll find that I've written 6 other books. All of them have different backgrounds and so forth. One of them, Paper Genders, talks about the history and how it came to be that where we are. Trans Life Survivors gives stories about people who survived it and how they came back from it. And so right at the website has a bunch of stories that people have written. That is the key place to go, sexchangeregret.com. You get a ton of information. Go to the library.
And you can purchase those books there.
Yeah, through the library you can purchase the book. Just hit the library button and buy the books.
One of the things I love about your work in a book like this, where you'd say, these are the articles, but the citations are also there.
Yeah.
What we're striving to do is have conversations that are supported by actual data.
Right.
Instead of just our opinions because we heard somebody say something, or we were raised a certain way, or we come from a particular, background. Man, it's so important to look at what's real.
Facts.
Yeah.
Facts matter.
Facts.
This
Facts
is the
matter.
good stuff. This has got the research in it.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you and the work that you do, and for spending time with us.
Yeah, thank you. It's been my pleasure. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
And I know you're helping a lot of folks, both who are struggling with this and those who are just trying to gather more information, understand how to deal with this in our culture. So thank you for the work you're doing. And I encourage anyone listening to go to Walt's website and learn more, get those books, and we're just I look forward to having you back on because I have like 100 more questions.
Yeah, I'd love to come back and,
We're going to write them in
and expand on this. I'd love to do it.
This is a very important conversation, and one that we've talked about a lot, you and I.
Yeah.
And to be able to bring Walt to come and break this down for us is amazing.
Yeah, as some military leaders, I'd love to have you sit with.
Yeah.
We're trying to figure out how to handle this issue in the military.
What a crazy conversation, and I hope that we're beginning to learn some things. I want to give our viewers, our listeners, the situation report today, really kind of the breakdown of this conversation. And again, a lot more we could talk about, but a few key things I would like for you to take away. The situation report begins with number 1, trauma impacts different people differently. This is something, again, in our work and on this show we talk about often is trauma. How it impacts each person will be different, but in order to treat someone who's struggling, we have to get to the underlying cause. Trauma is the underlying cause. When we address that, we can begin to move forward in a meaningful way. What an important aspect of this conversation to have. The second takeaway is this, as we look at what is important to understand, our culture has decided that this is the conversation we should be having right now, and we could argue about why the conversation is important right now. We may be right, we may be wrong. The reality is this, it is a conversation, it is being had, and yet it's often being had without an acknowledgement of the side effects, the impacts on individuals and families and lives that come with gender transition and the other things we're talking about today. We have to have the right look, the full picture as we're making these decisions, and how important it is for us to do that. The third takeaway, and this is an important takeaway, there is hope. There is always hope, and we like to communicate this as often as we can. Trauma, difficulty, bad decisions, your background, your past, what someone else did to you, there is always hope, and hope is always to be found if you'll lift up your view from where you are right now and understand there's something bigger and better out there. And appreciate that. Hopefully there's some good takeaways for you. Yeah. Chad, thank you.
Oh, awesome, man. Good job with the Glenn Beck sleeves.
I'm doing my best. I want to look like Glenn. And you got to imitate the best to be the best. That's what they say. Well, thank you. And for those that are watching, thank you for watching. Appreciate it. We'll talk to you soon.